Okay, so good afternoon and welcome again. We have prepared a few slides. Well, actually, a lot of slides, but they are mostly nice pictures. So don't worry, there's no equation here. Tired, we're at the end of the week, and it's Friday afternoon for everyone. So this talk is about telling you about our experience with tomographic campaigns, and so which results we got and what we learned by analyzing campaign data. So we start from forested areas. We say that forestry is by far the field where most of the effort were focused. And indeed, I would like to start from my first tomographic campaign back then in 2007, and I was a PhD student then. So the campaign was the BioSAR 2007. Well, actually, it was just called BioSAR back then because it was the first campaign. And so this campaign was supported by the European Space Agency with acquisition by DLR. The acquisition consisted in 9 fully polarimetric P-band SAR flight, or let's say the dataset used for tomography consisted in 9 full pole P-band flights. And the scope of this activity focused on tomography. Then there were other activities in the context of the same campaign. But for this one activity, the aim was to analyze the three-dimensional structure of this forest. This was a boreal, or rather a semi-boreal forest, using P-band SAR tomography. And here you have some results. So here on your left is a SAR image, much saturated. And along this red transit here, I am showing a vertical section at HH and HV. So to help interpretation, we overlay the LiDAR terrain elevation in black and LiDAR forest height in green. And this is quite interesting because this was our first tomographic campaign, and we didn't know exactly what we should expect. And in this case, we saw with a bit of a surprise that in HH, you see all of the energy is focused at the ground level. So here we have a forest here. And actually, you can see that there is a forest because in HV, so in cross pole, you see some contribution. But if you look at the copolar channel, so HH, for example, the forest is almost vanished. So in this case, all of the power comes from the ground. In HV, so in cross polarization, so the polarization where the contribution of the vegetation should be always very well visible, we can see the vegetation, so we can see a signal from the canopy, and you can see that it matches the LiDAR very well. But also at HV, we see that most of the energy is coming from the ground layer. And so this was an interesting result. And so our interpretation was that we have, in this particular case, relevant double bounce scattering. So this was discussed briefly by Laurent this morning. So our idea was that we see all this energy from the ground, not because ground scattering is stronger than canopy scattering. This would make no sense. But because of multiple interactions, so because of the wave impinging on the canopies, going back to the ground, and then back again to the radar. And this was very interesting because it means that so it gives an explanation to the phase center that you can observe that you can observe with interferometry, for example. And it also shows that in this case, the electromagnetic vertical structure of this forest is not what you would suppose it is. So it is not that you see most of the power from the top of the canopy, because of this mechanism, you see most of the power from the ground. So in this case, tomography was a sort of a diagnosis tool to understand what was going on. Then we have another example here from TropiSAR. So in this case, here is a tropical forest, again at P-band, again in the a campaign supported by ESA, and this time we have acquisitions by Onera. I like to show this image because it was interesting for us. There is a metallic tower in this forest that is used for scientific measurement, like flux measurement, for example. And here is how this metallic tower appears in airborne SAR tomography. So you can see here is the signal from the metallic structure that goes from 0 up to 55 meters. But let's talk about forest. And I can show you here vertical sections at HH and HV, this time for a tropical forest. And if you still remember how the boreal forest looked like, you can immediately observe a huge difference here. So this is a dense forest, and indeed for this dense forest, we have a strong signal both from the terrain level, but also for the canopy layer. So in this case, the signal from the canopy is immediately visible. So here, for example, at HH and at HV, you can see that the signal from the canopy is oftentimes even stronger than the signal from the ground. So this means that tomography is actually very sensitive to the structure, so to the vertical structure of the forest, and it is able to tell us about how the forest is responding to the wave in very details. And finally, here is the same example I showed this morning. This is more recent. This is from the AfriSAR campaign in 2016. And here is an example of a very high resolution tomography. In this case, it is not referred to the ground, so we did not subtract the reference to topography, so that you see that the signal is fluctuating and it is following the actual terrain topography. Another thing that we learned is that SAR tomography can be a very nice tool to estimate the terrain topography below the vegetation, and the physical principle by which you can do this is immediately understood here. So you can see that this the lower envelope of this tomogram is corresponding to the LiDAR DTM. So hence we are actually able to capture where the terrain is below the canopy. And so we were curious about this capability, and we could assess an error of let's say less than 3 meters between tomography and LiDAR. So in this case, of course, a very high resolution LiDAR, because it was requested to penetrate through the gaps of the forest. And by the way, so my claim is that actually this error is not entirely due to tomography, but it is probably a balance error between the error of the radar and the error of the LiDAR. So for this kind of product, I think it's fair to claim that a radar can be at least as accurate as a LiDAR. Then I think that tomography, especially for forestry application, became popular because of its role to enhance the link to forest biomass. So let's say that the popularity of low-frequency SAR for forestry applications was justified by graphs like this one. So in this case, we are showing the connection between forest above ground biomass and radar backscatter. And you see that we have a saturation, meaning that if you look at L-band, for example, you see that the radar backscatter increases up to about 50 tons per hectare. Then you just lose sensitivity, which means that based on this graph, you cannot use this signal to estimate forest biomass when it is in excess of, say, 50 tons per hectare. If you go to a very low frequency like VHF, you can see that this curve is able to retain sensitivity, whereas for P-band, you get some saturation, but not so much as in L-band. So basically, these graphs or studies of this kind were used to provide a justification for using low frequency to get forest biomass. And this is, of course, true. But what was observed in subsequent studies was that being sensitive to the whole forest structure also means that we are sensitive to many different scattering mechanisms. So we are for sure sensitive to backscatter from the canopy. We are for sure sensitive to trunk ground forward scattering, but we are also sensitive, for example, to canopy to ground forward scattering. And keep in mind that also trunk ground forward scattering is not only determined by the features of the trunk, which is reasonable to associate to forest biomass, but also to the local features of the ground. So, for example, on local soil moisture, on presence of understory, on terrain slope. So hence, let's say, on the one side, having penetration gives you sensitivity to the whole forest structure, hence a sensitivity also to forest biomass. On the other side, you are sensitive to many different ways of interaction between the wave and the forest structure, which means that it is more complicated to find a suitable physical model to retrieve forest biomass. So the question is, can 3D tomography help? And this was the answer provided in 2014. Basically, the idea of this experiment was just to run a phenomenological analysis. So what was done in this study by Hotonden Min, who was a PhD student at Polytechnico di Milano back then. What was done in the study was basically to simply correlate intensity to forest biomass as it was measured in situ by forest expert. And for intensity, we had different options. One option was to use the intensity of a single SAR image, and it is this one. And the graph here below reports the sensitivity of forest biomass to the intensity of this one SAR image. And you can see that there's not much sensitivity, basically. So this curve is increasing with biomass, but very slowly, and there is relevant dispersion. Then we simply try to do tomography and to observe whether the intensity of different tomographic layers would correlate better or worse to forest biomass. And here is the answer. Here we have the ground layer, and we can see that in this case we have a negative correlation. So the higher the higher is biomass, the lower is this ground intensity, which makes sense because if you have more biomass, then it's quite likely that the trees are bigger, are taller and more dense, and this is removing power from the ground. Here we have the mid-canopy layer, so at a height of about 50 meters above the ground. In this case, we do not have much sensitivity, but the nice finding was that if we focus on the signal about 30 meters above the ground, which corresponds more or less for this class of forest to the main canopy layer, then we have a lot of sensitivity to forest biomass. This was just a phenomenological study, so there was no model back then. And of course, when you have a scientific result, then you should try to repeat the experiment on a different test site and see if it keeps working or if that was just the case. And so from the TropiSAR campaign, we had data from another forest, about 70 kilometers inland with respect to this first test site, and we could observe the same result. So this was a very nice finding, and let's say this started to convince people that there is an actual link between tomography and forest biomass. And then finally, after the AfriSAR campaign in 2016, we could repeat the same analysis on different tropical forests and see more or less the same result. So in this case, we have a plot between a tomographic intensity at 30 meters and forest biomass for 5 different forests, of which we have 2 in French Guiana. So the same I showed before, and 3 more forests in Gabon, which are Lopé, Rabi, and Monda. And nice enough, the same result was replicated for a boreal forest, this time not at P band, but at L band. So in this case, we have again the in this case, it is not a sensitivity, but it is directly an estimation result. So here we have an estimation of forest biomass based on 2D SAR, so based on SAR intensity alone. And here we have an estimation of forest biomass based on SAR tomography. So far, so good. So we had different, let's say, we could find consistency of this result in different forest biomes, which was quite nice. And the next step to do was to provide some physical interpretation for this result. And so to do that, we started to focus on what the structure of a forest, of a tropical forest in this case is. And here is a very simplified structure. Of course, I am not an ecologist, so don't ask me to go in the very details of this because I'm not able to. But let's say that by and large, we can divide the forest in 4 layers, say the ground, the under canopy, the main canopy, and the overstory. The main canopy layer is interesting because it contains a major part of the leaves that convert the sunlight to energy. and it surely contains a large proportion of woody elements, and so this should contribute to total forest biomass. Under the canopy, let's say there is a little direct sunlight, and although it surely contains part of the trunk of woody biomass, for the ground layer, of course, we have a large proportion of forest biomass. So let's say, according to this interpretation, of course, the ground layer should provide a high sensitivity to forest biomass because it physically contains a large part of forest biomass. But when you see a forest through the eyes of a low frequency radar, this is not what you see, because tomography has proved, for the case of the boreal forest we saw before, but also for tropical forest, tomography has proved that the ground layer, so the scattering from the ground layer, is strongly determined by multiple scattering between the vegetation and the ground. So this was the phenomenon I was trying to explain before. You have the radar wave that is hitting on the vegetation. It is reflected not only back to the radar, but also towards the ground, and then it is reflected back to the radar. So when you use SAR tomography and focus the ground layer, this is the physical scattering mechanism you are sensitive to. And this scattering mechanism is perturbed by a number of different factors that are not connected to forest biomass, which include local terrain slope, soil moisture, presence of nearby tree, understories, and so on. So in a radar survey, the ground layer is dangerous because it is introducing a disturbance factor, basically. At this point, it is clear that one beneficial effect of SAR tomography is to eliminate this disturbing factor given by scattering from the terrain layer, from the ground layer. But the open question is, why do we observe the best correlation at 30 meters? And well, this is a more difficult question to answer, and we can only do this partially. But there are different elements that support the fact that for tropical forest, getting the analyzing this main canopy layer is meaningful. The first one is an ecological model. So in this case, we use this model called TROll, which is basically an ecological model able to predict how much of the forest biomass is contained in different layers. And according to this model, we have that the proportion of biomass in the canopy layer is about 1/3. But more importantly, that this ratio is very stable, meaning that for a wide range of biomass values, say from 250 to about 700 tons per hectare, this proportion is more or less constant. Hence, using this layer to as a proxy for total forest biomass makes sense. So let's say it is physically justified by this model. Other very interesting experiments are those done with LiDAR. And in this case, we have an experiment by Vittoria Meyer and Sasan Sachi at JPL. And basically, they analyzed the correlation between the area occupied at different heights with respect to forest biomass. And they found out that for a number of tropical forests, the best correlation is observed around 30 meters. And this is a LiDAR study, so it's a completely different world. But it does support this idea that for this class of tropical forest, this 30-meter layer is actually the best proxy for forest biomass. And then we also work with Matthias Disney at UCL, who could observe again using LiDAR data that the main canopy layer contains about 30% of the volume of the forest for tropical forest, not so for a temperate forest, for example. And indeed, you can see the difference between this one graph. This is hardwood, so this one is a temperate forest, which contrasts to the other ones, which are all from tropical forest. So basically, the observations is that the correlation of radar intensity to biomass in tropical forest improves dramatically if we use tomographic intensity at 30 meters. This was observed in a number of tropical forests at P-band and also in boreal forest at L-band. So our interpretation is actually that tomography brings a twofold beneficial effect on forest biomass retrieval. The first one is that it can single out the most biophysical relevant layer, at least talking about dense tropical forest. The second one is that it can cancel out ground scattering, which is a disturbing element if you're interested in forest biomass retrieval. And then just a sec, sorry. Then, based on this understanding, we had this idea to provide a simplified way to estimate forest biomass simply by, let's say, canceling out ground scattering. And this was a processing. This is a processing technique that was named notch filtering, and this is after the concept of notch filters that is popular in signal processing. Basically, it just takes two images and tries to compute the difference between these two images so as to remove the ground. And we could see that it is perhaps not as accurate, so it does not always provide the same sensitivity as SAR tomography because it is just rejecting the ground, so it is not really emphasizing this main canopy layer, but it is much better than using a single SAR image. And indeed, this ground notching technique or ground cancellation technique is actually assumed as part of the baseline strategy for forest biomass retrieval to be implemented by biomass. And so if you're interested in the detail, I can suggest you this paper by Xoia et al. Okay, then I would just like to show you this nice experiment, which was run again in French Guyana. Basically, the story is that after it was clear that SAR tomography could be beneficial in the context of forest missions such as biomass, the next question was, wait, what about a temporal decorrelation? Because with biomass, we will get an image every few days. So is it possible that we will have a temporal decorrelation that will completely destroy this result? So a first effort to answer this question was done was done by this study. So basically, the TropiSCAT campaign, which was a collaboration between ONERAC, NES, SSBio, and Polimi, consisted in installing a number of antennas on top of this metallic tower. This is the same tower I showed you before. And the idea was to provide tomographic imaging of the forest below for over 1 year, with a, let's say, with a time sampling of just 15 minutes. So this experiment provided us with wonderful, wonderful data, because for over 1 year, we could observe this forest. And so we could characterize what was happening in this forest in the morning, in the afternoon, overnight, doing tomography with different time lags, what happens when it rains, when it's sunny. And so this data set was a goldmine, really. And I would just like to show you here a very simple example. Here we have 4 instantaneous tomograms. By instantaneous tomograms, I mean that all the acquisitions, so all the so the signals at all of the antennas that is required to do a tomograph, to focus a tomographic section, was acquired within 15 minutes in dry conditions. So let's say this is the ideal result here. And you can see, so here you have scattering from the main canopy. In this case, it was about 30 meters. So the forest top height here is about 40 meters. And this is the scattering from the ground. And this is what happens when we mix acquisition gathered every third day, as will biomass. So this is, let's say, within the limitation of a ground-based experiment. This is like the best simulation we could have of biomass concerning the characterization of temporal effects. And this is what happens if we mix one rainy day or 2 or 3. So basically, we have a degradation of the tomogram. You see that it is not as focused as in the case of instantaneous tomograms in all sunny conditions, but it seems like the intensity variation due to weather changes is not terrible. So our assessment based on this data set, of course, this is just a ground-based experiment, so it is just representative for a single, not even for a single forest, but for a single patch within a single forest. But this patch is telling us that the error due to temporal effects, which includes decorrelation and change in weather conditions, can be quantified in about 50 to 80 tons per hectare, which in a forest of this density is about a 20% error. Okay, part 2. Part 2 is about snow and ice. And I would like to start with this other campaign, which again was supported by the European Space. Well, actually, all of the data I am showing were supported by the European Space Agency. So I will say thank you just once and stop mentioning it. This was a very nice campaign. So this is me and this is Laurent. So you see that we do not only talk, but we also walk every now and then. And this campaign consisted in installing, say, a portable tomographic radar in the context of so at 2 sites in the Austrian Alps to do tomography of the snowpack with a very fine resolution, and by very fine I mean centimeters. Here is the result. So here is the snowpack at X band, and here is the snowpack at KU band. So if I can help you understanding these sections, here is the 0. So the scattering here corresponds to the air-snow interface, and the same here. We are just changing frequency from this panel to this other panel. And then we have below this first layer, we have other layers down, in this case, down to a depth of about of about 160, 180 centimeters. Now, the first thing that you should note here is that this bottom layers are tilted. And indeed, if you squeeze your eyes a little bit, you would see that this tilt is increasing with depth. So the deeper the layer, the more tilted it appears. And this is not, let's say, this is not due to a physical slope, but it is just the old-fashioned Snell law. Basically, we have refraction, and so the target is focused at a different position. Of course, you can compensate for this. You can as well estimate the wave propagation velocity based on the radar data. And finally, we ended up in this corrected tomographic section. You can see that now all the layers appear to be flat. So our estimation of the propagation velocity seemed to be fine enough. And we were so lucky that we could compare this section against a snow profile done by snow expert who shoveled the snow pit right after our experiment. So it was very nice to see that every time that the radar senses a different layer, so we can count here like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 interfaces, we could observe that this is due to a change in the snow composition. So it seems like there is a lot of physics in a product like this. A similar experiment was done on Fjord ice. So in this case, the same equipment was installed on Fjord ice. And again, so the same story. There was a correction to compensate for the change of propagation velocity within the ice layer. And in this case, we can see the first layer. So it is the air snow layer. Then there is a snow ice layer. And finally, the ice seawater layer. It was nice to notice here that the bottom layer, maybe it is here, yes, that the bottom layer shows up particularly clearly at HV, which means that it presents some depolarized contribution. And this makes sense because it was observed that the ice layer was formed by irregular air bubbles. So which is consistent with the observation of a stronger depolarized contribution. Then, okay, so I can, no, I think I have time. I would also like to show you this campaign that we had in 2014 over the Mittelbergferner Glacier in the Eastern Alps. Basically, the idea here was to use tomography to image the internal structure of this glacier. And this time we wanted to do this at L-band to evaluate the potential of an L-band tomographic system for this kind of applications. So here is just a few information about this area. So here is a temperate glacier at the main ridge of the Alps in Tyrol. And so the altitude is about 3,000 meters. We had GPR, so in this case, this was done by the University of Heidelberg. So the GPR was worked on the top of the ice surface, which was a bit dangerous too because of crevasses, for a total length of 18 kilometers. And then we had measurement of the snow because of the snow pits and installation of reflectors for geometrical referencing. Here is the radar setup. So the aircraft was a CASA operated by an Italian company, the CGR, and the radar was by Metasensing. So here is the installation inside and outside the aircraft hull. The tomographic survey consisted in flying repeatedly along a novel racetrack, so we could gather about 20 acquisitions from two opposite heading directions. Here we have two SAR images, so this is just SAR focusing from a single trajectory. And here is an example of a tomographic section. So we have from both view, here we focused at so the same transit from two opposite views, and you can see that we have a very clear signature for surface scattering. We overlay here the LiDAR DTM to show you that so how precise a radar can be. And below this surface, we also have scattering from the interior of the ice body. Of course, also in this case, we have a geometrical displacement due to the change of propagation velocity within the ice. This was corrected using the old-fashioned Fermat's minimum time principle. And voila. At this point, we were able to focus a cube, so to focus an enormous amount of voxels that represent the reconstruction of this glacier in 3D. And all we had to do at this point was simply to cut a section along the same path that was worked by the GPR, so that we could compare the radargram by the GPR. So in this case, this upper panel is a 200 megahertz GPR against L-band tomography. And you can see here that there's a lot of common features. And in particular, with the help of ice experts, we could see that we have this formation here. So this bluish formation that corresponds to fern areas. These vertical stripes that show up in the GPR and in the tomogram as well correspond to crevasses. And then we also have a clear signature of the background. We have many sections of this kind. So in this case, this is the bedrock. So you can trace the bedrock depth in this glacier. And actually, this is just fun for radar engineers. In the GPR radargram, we have interference for a nearby ski resort, which are not present here because it is a different bandwidth, of course. And another profile, so you can see that more or less these two products are telling the same thing. And and this is nice. So this is a close-up where we can see clearly some fern layering, and most likely a detection of water pockets within the ice. And then, okay, this is just a nice picture that we generated to impress people and, for example, ask for a supercomputer, as it was suggested by a few students before. And here is an example to try to convey to a broader audience what kind of product tomography is able to generate. So you see that we have the polarimetric signature of the eyes changing as a function of depth. Oops. Okay, so this is it for the campaign. I would just like to conclude this talk talking about very briefly about spaceborne tomography. Oh, okay. I see there is a question, but I will take it later. So for spaceborne tomography, so the first thing that I had to tell you about is biomass, of course. Biomass is the ESA's forest mission. It will be the first P-band SAR in space. It was selected as the next ESA Earth Explorer Core mission and will be launched in 23. The mission objective is to determine the distribution of above ground biomass in the world's forest and to measure annual changes in the stock over the lifetime of the mission. Importantly, for the lecture of today, biomass will implement a dedicated tomographic phase for the first 14 to 16 months of mission lifetime. And during this phase, it will collect 7 consecutive passes over the world to provide the global tomographic coverage of the world forest. Here is just an example, so a very quick example. You have seen how many campaigns we had in support of biomass, but this is just a result that points in the specific direction of spaceborne tomography. Basically, a lot of activities were done to simulate prototype biomass data based on airborne data. And this activity also allowed us to finely tune biomass orbits and to assess what the performance of biomass retrieval, of forest biomass retrieval using the satellite biomass data would be. I would just like to spend the last word about bistatic spaceborne tomography. So here is the same slide as the one that was shown by Laurent. Basically, the idea is to have 2 different satellites that are able to acquire at the same time. So as this artistic view is trying to suggest. And in this way, you can get rid of temporal decorrelation. So there's no such a system in space at L-band. There is a system of this kind, which was Tandem X, of course. And I would say that the concept is already robust because it was studied many times. And also for forestry, it was at least partly demonstrated by Tandem X single pass interferometry. Also in this case, research activities were dedicated to simulate prototype L-band bistatic data based on airborne campaign data. And this is just an example of what the retrieval performance could be like. Just to say that the analysis done so far support that all the results that we had from campaign data could in principle be replicated in the context of a spaceborne bistatic mission. And this is it. So this is just to wrap up. Let's say that SAR tomography is a wonderful tool for 3D structure of distributed media, and this holds whenever penetration occur. So it is true for forest, snow, ice sheet, glacier. And so the theory is evolving at the end rapidly. So Laurent cited the paper by Knell and Cardillo in the mid-90s. Then we had the first experiment. In 2000, we had the first airborne demonstration by Reichberg and Moreira, which was quite inspiring for all of us, I would say. And ever since 2007, tomography was, let's say, more intensively considered in the context of biomass preparation activities, and also in the context of for the preparation of bistatic missions like SAR-CS and Tandem-L. In a few years, biomass will be launched, and it will provide the first global tomographic coverage of tropical forest. There's still a lot of research. There are a lot of active research groups that are working on characterization of biomass on the generation of new products for forestry. So I said, and I repeated, that forestry is more advanced. So the research today is more focused on the generation of novel products that can be exported outside the field of radar expert. Whereas I would say that for snow, ice sheet, and glaciers, we're still in the phase of assessing the potential and demonstrating some killer application to have to request a spaceborne mission, for example. For arid terrains, I have no experience on arid terrains for what concerns spaceborne tomography, except a campaign we had in Morocco with the Italian Space Agency. But I would like to mention that there will be an ESA campaign in Namibia to study the tomographic response of sand dunes. And so I would say that there's also a lot to research on concerning signal processing. So either you are ecologist or environmental researcher, or if you are die-hard signal processing guys, this can be the right place for you. Okay, so this is it. Okay, so here is just a few slides that will go hyper fast. The SAR-SIM database. Well, a few years ago, there was a study by Polimi, Université de Rennes, Chalmers, DLR, and Onera, with the goal to build a reference dataset for current and future researchers on SAR tomography, focused on the particular case of forests, so boreal, temporal, tropical forest, and focused on P-band and L-band. So the result of this study was the generation of two databases. One is SAR-SIM, the other is called SAR-SIM Plus. Basically, they come as a single item, so don't worry. And the first one includes airborne data from the campaign, simulated spaceborne data, and ancillary information, whereas SAR-SIM Plus includes processed tomographic data. So basically, you can use SAR-SIM to look at airborne images, to look at simulated spaceborne images, and to use these images to generate your own tomographic boxes. Or if you're just interested in the tomographic boxes and you do not want to spend your time in learning how to generate this from the raw data, then you can use SAR-SIM Plus, which provides you directly with this tomovoxels. I can go faster, so I promised I would, and I will. Here is the list of the data set that are contained in SAR-SIM. So we have from AfriSAR the Lope site. So here is the tropical forest. We have data at P-band and L-band by DLR, ONERA, and JPL. For what concerns boreal forest, we have data from BioSAR and BioSAR 2008 acquired by DLR at P-band for Remnistorp and at L-band for Mictlan. Whereas for temperate forest, we have part of the Tronstein dataset acquired by DLR at L-band. Okay, I have to mention here the friendly collaboration with Marco Lavalle and Scott Hensley at JPL, because they were so kind to allow us to process their data set and include it in this release of SAR-SIM. Both datasets come with MATLAB functions. So you have, let's say, a demo function, which allows you to load the data, but not just to load and display the data. You can also take a look at a simple tomographic processor. So you can see a code that we implemented that is able to generate tomographic voxels out of SAR data. And okay, and it also comes with the user manual. So this is the table of content. Basically, you have tomographic imaging principles, you have mathematical models, you have a description of different focusing approaches, so like a 3D back projection, beamforming, and so on. You have a section on correlation tomography, and you have an introductory section about phase calibration. So I didn't mention today that a very important thing for every kind of interferometric analysis is to remove the so-called phase screens. What is a phase screen? It's basically an unwanted phase term that if you don't remove it, it will degrade all the performance of any interferometric or tomographic analysis. So the procedure by which we eliminate this phase screen is called phase calibration. So most importantly, all the data within SAR-SIM have been phase calibrated for you. So you do not need to struggle to sway it for phase calibrating the data. They are ready. And then we have information on the generation of Spaceborne simulated data and description. Of course, many researchers spent a lot of time for generating these data sets. So if you decide to use this data, please acknowledge their work and remember to include these references in your future successful papers. Just an example. Here is the display of a SAR intensity image by, in this case, it is by JPL. Here is an interferogram from the same data set. This is an analysis of the vertical resolution that you can get. Here is the interferometric processor, so you can take a look at the correlation, coherence, and phase of all possible image pairs. And you can do tomography. So this is, you have a MATLAB function that does it for you. So, so it is open, so you can look into it and learn how we do it. I know MATLAB is not an open software, but of course the scripts are open for you. So even if you don't want to have a MATLAB license, you can take a look at the script and see. I think that in the latest release, all the scripts have been translated to Python. So in case this should be available as well. If it can run with Octave, I have no idea. I've never tried. Maybe, or maybe with just a little effort, but I don't know any better. So again, here is the, okay, this is SAR-SIM, so it is loading the tomographic boxes, and here it is just displaying a tomographic intensity. And I think this is it. Now, how to put your hands on SAR-SIM? Unfortunately, it is not yet so simple because SAR-SIM was released when ESA was in process to establish the MAP tool. And so it was decided not to release SAR-SIM directly, for example, through the campaign portal, but through MAP. So for this reason, it is not there yet, but it should be there very soon, or maybe it is already there at the time I am talking now. So you can access this data set and you should be able to get it. Maybe not now, but you will in the near future. If you really can't wait and you want to take this data set now, you can just write me an email. And so here is my email address. So the whole data set is several hundreds of gigabytes. So I cannot share it all just due to connection issue, but I can share a small subset of SAR-SIM, which contains some data set and most importantly, the user manual and working codes. So we can at least share this one and you can start. And this is it.